Dr. Kennedy Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the first speech of today's general debate, my colleague Russell Norman spoke of the need for a popular movement to bring climate change to the top of the international political agenda. I want to go from there to the theory of climate protection, why there is such a need to make climate the policy issue of our time. It is 25 years since climate change was placed on the international political agenda. The IPCC's first assessment report of 1990 laid the scientific basis for concern, and 92 was the watershed year with the Framework Convention and the formal objective of climate stabilisation. We are still operating within that framework, even as we negotiate the global agreement for Paris in December. Yet it cannot be said that nations have made climate change their top priority, certainly not over the first 2 decades of this period, and not even today. There is a tendency to see it as agenda item 11B on Cabinet's weekly agenda, to which we shall turn our attention after the tea break. And equally significantly, we believe the problem will be solved through simply trying harder rather than acting differently. The result is that global climate policy has been vulnerable to factual denial for the first 20 years. In the past 5, extreme weather events have forced us all to accept climate change as a reality. At last, the international community is facing up to the inconvenient truth that after 10 millennia of existence, human society is fundamentally altering the planet's habitable zone. We have left the Holocene era, we have entered the Anthropocene, and we are placing ourselves and other life forms at serious risk. But what remains contentious is whether the problem can be solved through a refinement of the existing worldview and economic orthodoxy, or whether, to quote a famous commentary, this changes everything. If the problem can be solved by establishment thinking, the line goes, there is nothing to worry about. But if it requires a qualitative change in our thinking, then we better change immediately, because nature will not wait for us to catch up with reality. And that is where the debate must focus in the remaining months before Paris. This dilemma surfaced during our discussions recently in Europe with the Speakers' Tour over the past few weeks. 2 worldviews were articulated, both by us as a visiting delegation and by our hosts. The establishment view is that with global food demand expected to rise by 50%, New Zealand has an obligation to feed 5 to 10 times its own population, and we must strive to maximise agricultural productivity. This takes on, among its advocates, a moral hue, a manifest destiny. It dignifies the commercial interest. This is buttressed by the argument that resulting emissions will be tamed by scientific progress. Yesterday's news from Massey University that recent research portends big reductions in livestock methane is a case in point. This basically sees food security as the global policy driver and sustainability as the subordinate constraint to be managed. The alternative view reverses this order. It sees global sustainability, the 9 planetary boundaries of which climate change is one, as the global policy driver, and food security as dependent on that sustainability. We shall not be feeding 10 billion people 40 years from now with a degraded planet and a raging climate. There will not even be 10 billion people. The latest news says there is a 10% chance of a planet 6 degrees hotter than normal. Our stated goal is to keep the increase to 2 degrees. A 6-degree world is beyond catastrophe. It is essentially a death sentence. Avoiding that requires consensus among and within nations in the next few years, one that reconciles the tensions behind these 2 worldviews. Let me say that I respect the worldview that bequeaths so much prosperity to humankind over recent centuries. But I ask in return for respect of the alternative, the so-called alarmist worldview, that we must qualitatively change our approach now and develop new and far-reaching policy positions as a country leading up to Paris. We need a cross-party consensus on this greatest of all human challenges.
Mr. Speaker.
And on this occasion, the Honourable Dr Nick Smith can make his contribution to the general debate.
Mr Speaker, can I